Good morning, well, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to Class Festival. I'm Andrew Kelly from Bristol Ideas and I'm chairing the session this lunchtime, which I'm delighted to be doing. We've been working with Natasha Carthew. I don't think she's in the room actually, I'm just looking around, on this festival for some time, and I wanted, which is a shame if she's not here, I wanted to pay tribute to her for organising this, establishing it and raising all the funding for it, and we wish it a long life, and we hope very much to be associated with it in the future. I should add that the original chair of this event, Simon, is unfortunately ill, and we wish him well as well. So I'm taking over. So on my, with this fantastic range of speakers, we've got on my left is Alberto Prunetti. He's Italian, born in an industrial town near a steel mill, son of a welder and a housewife. First travelled abroad at 28, and this is his biography, to work in a toilet in Bristol as a pizza chef in fake Italian restaurants, and then as a translator of George Orwell, Angela Davis and David Graeber, and now director of the publishing series named Working Class, and author of the book Down and Out in England and Italy, which is out next month in the UK, but there's copies available outside. To my immediate right is Rachel Trezize, novelist and playwright from South Wales, who won the inaugural Dylan Thomas Prize in 2006. Her most recent novel is Easy Meat, which is available again outside with our bookshop friends Storysmith. And she has a monologue called Unicorns, broadcast on BBC4 TV in January as part of a series called Skint, looking at present-day poverty in the United Kingdom. That's maybe something we'll be talking about as we go through. Next is Sharon Duggal, who writes a novelist and short story writer. Her second novel, Should We Fall Behind, was published last year by Blue Moose Books and was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's 2021 Encore Award. Short fiction appears in various anthologies, including The Book of Birmingham and Love Bites, fiction inspired by Pete Shelley and Buzzcocks. And she's also one half of Brighton-based Radio Refurb's long-running The Ruben and Sharon Show, the UK's only radio show with a mum and son presenter team. Next to Sharon is Mohsin Zaidi. Mohsin is a barrister and is author of the award-winning memoir, A Dutiful Boy. I did have a copy of the book, but I've given it to Mohsin, so he's got it. So if you hold it up, there we are, which is published by Vintage. Tells the story of growing up in a devout Muslim household in East London before becoming the first person from his school to go to Oxford University, where he eventually came out. And next to Mohsin is Brian Reade, 40 years a journalist, 27 of them, most recently, at the Daily Mirror, where he writes as a weekly column and where he's led social justice campaigns, such as the fight to establish the truth about the Hillsborough disaster. His most recent book is Diamonds in the Mud, which argues that if working class kids were educated about the achievements of those from their own class, more might realise they are capable of changing the world. So I think you'd agree, an absolutely fantastic panel. And we've got a lot to discuss. I'm going to ask each of them just to tell us a little bit about their work, perhaps do a short reading from their book, and then we'll move into the general discussion. I'm going to start with Alberto on my left. Do you need a copy of your book? Or?
Well, why not? Yeah. Just to give me courage.
There we are.
Okay, so firstly, sorry if I don't really speak, I have a kind of broken English, but this is part of my working class origin. Where I am a middle class person, I could travel abroad. I'm from Italy. I could have learned English in formal schools, but I had to travel at 27 just to get a job in as a cleaner in a toilet in Bristol to learn Shakespeare language. So you will understand me. My biography is more or less the same. All the people here around in this festival. My mom was a housewife. My father was a blue collar, a welder, very trained and specialized with a good wage. But he was exposed to asbestos and other chemicals, working in steel mills and oil refineries, and he died for a cancer related to his professional activity. And faced to go to the uni. I got a degree. I had no capital cultural, and also as I live in Mediterranean country, not really good net of family relationship to earn a living in my field. So after a couple of seasons in working as a handy boy or in restaurants and so on, I decided to move to the UK. It was many years ago, and I work in lots of minimum wage jobs. Once back, I didn't really was willing to tell my story, you know, because I said nobody will care. It's just ordinary thing. But I was very full of rage for the death of my father, and I tried to write his story. And I start to present this manuscript to some publisher, and they replied to me telling that they don't really care. I mean, they say it's not us, it's the marketing office that doesn't send us good signs for the story of a working man killed by cancer. And so I was very, very sad, and I say nobody really cares, it's not an important story. And I sent my story to a very small publisher after many refusals. And it happens that this book for 1 year has been the book about many people spoke. I got lots of reviews, invitation festival, and so on. And they start to say, this is, in Italy, they don't want to use the word class. They say it is industrial literature, just to avoid to say working class literature. And they also refused my Facebook because there was so much rage in it. So after that book, I was now in the position to write a second book about my own experience. And I present this new manuscript to the top publisher because I was now a kind of established author. And what happens is that in Italy, you can write the Facebook about your bad jobs, but then in the second book, you must switch to not working class things. And I did again, and they told me, oh, again, working class people, again, too much rage. And I got also lots of refusals. It took 6 years to find a main publisher for this book. Then I found a good Italian publisher, and the book has been translated in Spanish, French, Greek, and now in English. I was fed up with the refusal from the middle-class Italian publishing industry, and I decided to launch a new project that is a working-class literature series with a small leftist publisher, very small, I'm sorry, but we try to offer this chance to Italian working-class voices to find easily a publisher. And I also try to, as my stories are, just not really a part of the working class, because working class is a very stratified thing. I had this idea that the working class series would in part help me to find voices that are not represented in my narrative. For instance, like women, working class and stories, or LGBTQ people, working class people. And that is what we are doing. We publish 1-2 books every year, Italian or translated. In the last one, it was The Road to Wigan Pier. That is a bit different because it's a middle-class view on the English working class. But we are very proud of what we have doing so far. And they cannot say anymore that the working class doesn't exist in the publishing Italian industry.
So we'll come back to some of those points, thank you. But just a couple of points, just to ask you quickly. Was the first book ever published you did? Or that's the first book you...
No, this is the second.
This is the second one.
The first one was Asbestos, about my father's death. But usually it's part of a working class trilogy that is fully translated in Spanish and in Greece. In France, only Asbestos has been translated. Here in the Great Britain, the publisher thought that it was good to start with a book set in England.
Right, okay, yeah. And the second question was, did you learn Shakespeare from working in a toilet in Bristol?
Well, of course. Very often people think that working class people are not, of course, they are not posh, but they care about culture. They are proud of Shakespeare as they are proud of their own football team. So even maybe they were not well-mannered, but I met people, especially when I was working not in the toilet, but as a kitchen assistant in Dorset, in a canteen. There was a very old radio actor. He was a bit sick person with lots of health problems. So he was down to minimum wage jobs. He was working with that, serving food kitchen, but he was still acting in some way. He was serving food and acting like an actor. And his English was really posh. His body was not really posh, but his English was great. And it seems that this is another thing about working class people, that we think that very often beauty has been stolen to us. And this is true. For instance, I was here in Bristol, and I can remind every single brick of the place in which I was working, and the city center I have nearly forgotten. All this beauty was forgotten, was stolen by my job, minimum wage job. And this actor, in some way, was keeping the beauty of his life as a Shakespearean interpreter. So I learned through him.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, I'll come to you next, if that's okay. Yeah.
You want me to talk a bit about mine?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm originally from Birmingham, and I live in Brighton, and Should We Fall Behind is my second novel. And my background, I suppose I never really saw my background through the lens of class until I'd left home to go to university, which was quite a rare thing, from where I was from, in a place called Handsworth in Birmingham. My parents are immigrants, and I think class and the lives of immigrants, that there's a whole other story going on there. It doesn't easily fit into the kind of parameters of working class, middle class, upper class, or whatever. There's a lot more complexity, I suppose, to it. So, class was never something we talked about. It was never how my parents saw themselves. They didn't see themselves as working class. They saw themselves as immigrants. My mum came to this country when she was 12. I went to school, so her father came over and worked in the factories in Birmingham all his life. And my dad was one of those people that came over as the sort of £3 in the pocket generation. So, young men that came over to look for work weren't allowed to come over with more than £3 in their pockets, but also probably didn't have more than that anyway. And I grew up as part of a big family. There's 6 of us, and 3 of us went to university. 3 of us didn't. I did go to university. I was probably the only person in my school that year that went to university. I know we'll probably touch on some of that later. Because I didn't go to the grammar school, basically. So it's a horrible grammar school system. So my first book was called The Handsworth Times, and it's not biographical, but it's very much rooted in the world I grew up in. And Should We Fall Behind is my second novel, and it's kind of based in an unnamed city because I kind of wanted it to reflect any city actually with a river through it, so like Bristol. And it's not so much rooted in the British Asian community as the Handsworth Times was. This is about a group of people who have come to the city through sort of different routes, different lives, different experiences, and they find themselves living side by side in the part of the city, but they're kind of invisible to each other. And actually they're the sort of people that are invisible to a lot of people, actually, And then a young man from a different part of the country becomes a catalyst for their lives colliding. And it's told through 5 different perspectives, and I'm just going to read a very short bit. One of the characters is an older Indian woman called Reade Banu, and she lives with her partner, her husband of many years, and they came similar to my parents. They came from northern India to sort of settle in a city here. So it's not based on my parents, but it's... I'll read you a little bit of Raya's story. Raya Banu ran. As soon as she could walk, she ran. At first, she just ran around the tumble-down timber structure where she lived on the west side of Delhi. Then, when she was firmer in her footing, she ran around the small backyard, causing chickens to flap and cluck in her wake. Copper dust plumed around her wherever she went, and when sheets which had taken a whole day to wash were coated in a film of fine orange, her small legs stung from the slapping she received as a result. On her 5th birthday, she ran out of the front door and way past anywhere she'd run before. She wanted to see what was beyond the crisscross of alleyways surrounding her little shack, and what lay beyond the horizon, which appeared as a thin, bright blue line across the top of the ramshackle jigsaw of dwellings. She ran without losing her breath, skipping over dank gullies, skimming the cart of the tea-wallah, causing his steel cups to rattle as she passed by, tripping on a lauki from the wobbly vegetable stand, always piled high with mountains of bitter melon and okra. As she ran, she could hear her mother's voice calling for her, echoing across tin rooftops, fading away and then becoming louder as she whirled through the maze of streets. When she'd passed the same tethered goat on the roadside for the 3rd time, she stopped, sat on the curb around the corner of the crossroads, and waited for a sign which would lead her back home. None came, so she began to shout, quietly at first, and then more and more urgently, "Mama, I'm here, Mama. I want to come home." Her voice crackled and was so inconsequential that not even the goat batted an eyelid. She began to sob. Suddenly, Satish, the boy from the house at the back of her own, was in front of her, holding out his hand. "Come, Raya, I will lead you home," he said. So that's a bit of Raya's backstory. All the characters, we just sort of find out a bit more through the book of how they've arrived in the place they're at now. So
Thank you very much, Sharon. We'll come back to
Pleasure.
some of these points you've discussed. Mohsin, could you go next?
Sure. So I grew up in a council house in Walthamstow in East London, and the first thing to say is that people are like, you don't sound like you grew up in a council house. Funnily enough, I've always sounded like this. So when my mum came to the country from Pakistan, they moved straight into a house in Woking. And so I sound like I'm from there rather than from Walthamstow, where, I mean, Walthamstow is famous for E17, the band. So if you know them, you'll know Walthamstow. And I guess because we're at a working class writers' festival, it's really important for me to say that outright, because otherwise you'll be like, I don't believe a word this guy is saying. So I guess having explained my accent, I'm going to tell you a little story about when I started to realise that I was poor. I was, as you've heard in the introduction, the first person from my school to go to Oxford. It's not something I'm proud of. Actually, I think it's appalling, and we can talk about that later. But I remember walking into, every Oxford college has its own bar, and I remember walking into the college bar in my first week, and these two guys were arguing, and they said, "Mohsin, sit down, you can fix this for us." Which one's better, Eton or Harrow? I went to Eton, he went to Harrow, which one's better? And I paused, and I said, I don't know what those are. And they looked really perplexed. And they said, what? There are schools. How have you never heard of Eton or Harrow? And so I replied, well, I went to Kelmscott Secondary School. Have you heard of that? And I wasn't being witty. It was ignorance, because I didn't understand that there was this distinction between them and us. And they said, no. But I could tell that there was something really awkward. And so I changed the subject, and I said, when are our student loans coming in? Because I'm going to be on pot noodles soon. And they said, we don't have student loans. And at the time, I didn't appreciate English etiquette. And so I said, how do you pay for things? And they were like, oh, well, our parents give us money. So your parents just have thousands of pounds in a bank account that they can just give you? And they looked offended and surprised, but they answered the question and said yes. I knew that people like Bill Gates existed. I knew that there were some really, really rich people. But I had no idea that there was this middle class. This is before social media. I just didn't appreciate the world that we lived in. And that was the first time that I realised that in some way my background made me different, other than my skin colour, which was obviously made me stand out in a place like Oxford anyway. Because I remember going home that evening and calling my mum and saying, "Mum, these guys don't have student loans." And it was her having to explain to me what the implications of that was. So this book, although it is about sexuality and faith, and the excerpt I'm about to read is from the moment that I take my fiancée, who's here, to meet my parents, the book for me is just as much about race and class as it is about sexuality and faith. Her promise to meet him was only to placate me. It was hollow, like our love had become. For 10 years, my mum had resisted, fought against the idea as though she were holding off an army at the castle gates. And yet, here we were, a day I thought would never come, the drawbridge about to lower. In battle, are you ever really ready for the white flag? In the moment, the focus is on the fight, so when surrender comes, the impact of it might leave you dumbfounded. But my plan had worked. I'd played the long game and won. My heart didn't jump for joy or skip a beat. It lay inert and heavy in my chest. My boyfriend and I would visit her and my dad at their home, a home from which it felt like so much of me had been exiled. Now, though, we would both go there to eat Pakistani food, cooked with her hands, with her history. Tastes from a faraway place to usher in an equally foreign concept. My parents lived in a London suburb 6 stops east from Mile End on the Central Line. Those 6 stops were almost as familiar to me as the family home itself. Usually, I travelled alone, and at each stop, a part of me would fall away. At Stratford, I would forget what they had said to me. At Leighton, I would discard what they had done. By Leytonstone, I'd put down the anger I felt towards Islam, dear to them and once so dear to me. At Snaresbrook, I'd suppress my anger towards them. Then South Woodford, the penultimate stop. That's where I would leave behind what I cherished most of all, my love for him. To take it with me would have been to disrespect, to demean it. On this day, though, no part of me would be left behind, not my love for him and not him either, not his whiteness or the sharp blue of his eyes. If only I could dim the bright blue, which I loved so much, just for that evening. Make him smaller, moulded to fit neatly into their closed hearts. Hours before we left, I lay on the bed, feeling as blank as the ceiling I stared at. I couldn't do it, I told him. As I spoke, cracks formed in my numb veneer. Beneath it, a seething rage. I told him I was sorry, and I was sorry. I was desperate to go through with it, but consumed by anger towards her, at myself, and at the rules that had built a wall between us. But then we were on our way, on a train heading for the unknowable. I held on to him more tightly as we got closer, for once hanging on to those things I had become so accustomed to leaving behind. We stood outside the house. 2 men. My dad opened the door. I asked him where she was, and his frown made my heart sink.
Thank you very much, Mohsin. Thank you. Rachel, I'll come to you next.
Okay, so my novel, Easy Meat, was a commission from my Wales-based publisher. He just wanted me to tell the story of somebody on the day of the Brexit vote, from the time he woke up till the time he went to bed, a working class man, who comes from the Rhondda Valley, the former coal mining valleys, which is where all my work is set. To give you an idea, I'm just going to read from the beginning a few pages. This is the point where he wakes up, Caleb. The title Easy Meat refers to the working classes and also to the slaughterhouse where he works. The sound of gunshots came and went, barely penetrating Caleb's sleep. Steadily he began to register them, and beneath them, heavy breathing, menacing but familiar. A stench of weed had saturated the tiny bedroom. He could taste it behind his nostrils and feel it caught in his tongue. He kept his eyes closed against the artificial light until he heard an urgent clatter of plastic fracturing. He opened his eyes to his younger brother sprawled on the bed opposite, a video game frozen on the TV screen. There was only one bed and his brother was sleeping in it for the month. He'd been lucky enough to call Prince's opiate overdose in their ongoing game of celebrity death pool. It was a bumper year. David Bowie, Muhammad Ali, and the rapper from A Tribe Called Quest all gone. Sorry, bro, Mohsin said. I can't get the head off this last mannequin in Nuketown. It's gripping my balls. The Xbox controller was on the floor against the skirting board, batteries spilled on the carpet. Caleb could see through the Spider-Man curtains that it was light outside. His phone was plugged in the charger next to Mason's bed. What's the time then, Bat? He asked his brother. 10:05. Mohsin took a lit spliff from the dirty mug on the floor next to the bed and sucked greedily on it. The fuck is that? Caleb asked, tasting the cannabis anew. Smells rank. He raised himself onto his elbows, the metal springs hard in the thin mattress of the rolled-out bed settee. Special cush, chill as anything, have a go. Mohsin handed the spliff down to Caleb, then produced a can of Lynx Apollo from under his pillow and sprayed it into the air. Before Caleb knew what he was doing, the roach of the zoot was between his lips, the bitter smoke burning the back of his throat. Shit, Mace, he said, remembering he'd given up smoking 6 weeks ago. You know I'm trying to stay on the straight and narrow. He handed the spliff back to his brother. He tried to cough the weed out of his lungs. Mohsin laughed. I ain't your keeper, am I? Yes, Caleb said. We're supposed to look out for each other. You are, bro. You're the oldest. He took a hit of the spliff. Guess what happened to me last night anyway, he said. Wait till I tell you. Caleb hiked his head at his brother as if to say, go on. His alarm hadn't gone off yet. He still had time. That barmaid, Mohsin said, the ginger one with the rack, she only asked me to fuck her, didn't she? When you going to fuck me, Mace, she says, when she's giving me my £3 change. Fucking gobstruck, bro. That's why you're here playing Call of Duty. Well, I wouldn't do that to Brandy, would I? I don't know, it's not like Brandy's your real girlfriend, is it? She's a million miles away on the other side of the globe. Globe, Mohsin said, as if. She's eating corn dogs in Central Park. Bro, I told you, she lives where Breaking Bad is set. It's the desert, not New York. Caleb broke into the chorus of a song he'd heard the old man listening to in the car. Hot dog, jumping frog. What do you know about real girlfriends anyway? Mohsin said, cutting him off. Caleb threw the duvet off his chest, the cool morning air hitting his skin like a slap. He sat up, settee springs creaking. What were you doing up the pub on a Wednesday anyway? I thought you were skint. He took an old polo shirt from the pile of clothes, draped over the arm of the settee and pulled it over his head. Had to see Kinsey, didn't I? He owed me a tenner for that eighth of soap we bought for bank holiday. Kinsey practically lives in the pub. Bank holiday? What's so special about bank holiday when you're unemployed, Mace? Fucking hell, bro, wind your neck in. It's none of your business where I go on a Wednesday or on bank holiday or anything. You're either half-baked or out on the piss. You're supposed to be looking for a job. Mohsin shout whispered at Caleb. There ain't no jobs to find, Cal. I'm doing all the work the agency will give me. That's what a 0 hours contract is. 0 fucking hours. Not that it's anything to do with you. You ain't my boss, Bat.
Thank you, Rachel. Final, Brian, could you introduce your book?
Yeah, sure. It's called Diamonds in the Mud, and it's about working class heroes that I've met through... My primary job is a journalist, so 40 years as a journalist. I've sought out a lot of working class heroes, mainly on the left. And the reason I thought their stories were interesting and needed telling was that I've always thought that history in this country is taught through a narrow prism about people at the top, kings and queens and princes, Eton educated prime ministers, public school adventurers. Now, that's not to say they don't deserve their place, but it seemed almost exclusively that that's what kids were taught about. You know, these were the heroes, these ones who forged your history, when a lot of people below actually were doing heroic things and were actually shaping their lives. And it hit home to me when Mike Leigh was making this film about the Peterloo Massacre, called Peterloo. And Mike said, I grew up 5 minutes away from St. Peter's Field where it happened. And this was a pivotal event of the 19th century. It was the 19th century's Bloody Sunday. 18 working class people were killed by sabre-rattling cavalrymen. And all they were doing was protesting against, they wanted voting reform. So it was a major pivotal event. The Manchester Guardian was set up afterwards. Shelley wrote a poem about it. It was seen, and concessions were given to the working class. And yet he said, we didn't learn anything about that in my school. It was 5 minutes away, and it's now being fully on the national curriculum. He said, I learned loads about Henry VIII's wives. I could name every one of them, you know, but what did that mean to me? How did they mean more to me than what happened 5 minutes from where I lived? So it got me thinking, that it played into my kind of narrative of what I'd been percolating as a book, if you like. And then the start of lockdown, we were fed this bullshit that the notion of heroism in this country had changed, that it was the nurses now, it was the low-paid who were the real heroes amongst us, and all the others, the pop stars, the politicians, they didn't matter. So we all clapped them every Thursday, didn't we? And it was like, yeah, it's all changed now. And I just thought, that's just proper bullshit. Because a year down the line, the honours list is going to be filled with political lackeys and people who crawl their way up to the top and want knighthoods. They'll get a few trinkets thrown at them, the bottom ones. And they won't get a pay rise that beats inflation. So that's bollocks, you know. And that's what happened. And there was other events that happened during lockdown. I mean, here in this city, the Colston statue and what was happening with the Cecil Rhodes at Oxford, that younger people were saying, well, this isn't explained to us what all this is about, what Colston's about. We're just up there, you know, we want a different view of history. And Prince Philip died. Prince Philip, who had, and I counted it, 328 pages the day after his death in national newspapers, 343 the next. This was like this major event. A man who, yeah, did a little bit in the Second World War, so did a lot of people, but basically walked 2 foot behind his wife for 70 years, you know, without complaining. But, you know, this is this massive loss to everybody in this country, which, again, I thought was quite bollocks. So, again, I thought of the stories that I'd met through... So I'd sought out people like Dennis Skinner, the great Jack Jones, who's known as a trade unionist, but fought in the Spanish Civil War, Barbara Castle, in Equal Pay for Women. And through my job, I'd met heroic justice fighters like the Hillsborough Mothers, like Doreen Lawrence, and just people who, like football fans who'd set up food banks to feed the poor, and had then got to Parliament, like Marcus Rashford, causing Boris Johnson to do U-turns on school meals. And I just thought, well, I had a unique take on all of them, because I'd interviewed them at some point, or I'd been involved in their fight for justice. So I thought, well, I'll set out the intro. I'll do a big kind of, you know, essay at the front of the book about the notion of why I think it needs to change, how working class... We need to learn our history from below, and these people, if their stories were taught in schools, then maybe our kids might have, working class kids, sorry, state school kids, might have a fraction of the confidence enjoyed by public school kids who just seem to, not of their fault, but they have this kind of, a lot of them have an entitlement almost. I mean, if you've had 5 Booker Prize winners and 3 Prime Ministers go to your school, why couldn't you be one of them? Whereas most normal state schools in the country, they haven't really. And so I just thought, well, part of the problem there is the history of the people amongst them who've achieved so much is not taught to them. And so that's what it's about, really. That's the book.
Well, we'll pursue some of those stories, I think, as we go through. I want to ask all of you a question, which is about when you decided you wanted to be a writer, and what that felt like, and what were the kind of obstacles that you encountered in those early stages. Mohsin, can I start with you on that?
Yeah.
I saw you making notes.
No, I think there's a barrister in me just writes everything down.
Right.
So it's interesting you say that, because I didn't make the decision. And I think, you know, to touch upon what you've just said, because I never had the confidence, even though, you know, I'd been to Oxford and I was a barrister, I never would have thought, oh, I can be a published author. And funnily enough, when we get as authors, you get media trained, and when you answer this question, you're kind of trained to give this, oh, I always had a book in me. But I'm going to be completely honest, I didn't have a book in me. Penguin ran a scheme for underrepresented people who were thinking about writing. And I saw it advertised on Twitter. And you only had to submit 750 words. And I had written down the experience of coming out to my parents for myself and for my partner, because it was so important. I thought it was probably the scariest and potentially the most important thing I was ever going to have to do. And I didn't want to forget all the detail and the nuance. So I saw this advert, and I thought, well, I've got 750 words. And so I entered. And then at each stage in the process, I kept kind of advancing, and they were like, okay, now we need 5,000 words, now we need 10,000 words, and I was like, oh crap. So I was, you know, writing it down and then submitting it. Wasn't really reading it back, wasn't really editing it, because I was also busy being a lawyer. And ended up being one of the winners of the competition, which was unbelievable. So in answer to your question, I never thought I could be a writer, and I was really fortunate to the Penguin Right Now programme for, you know, getting me to the point where I'm sat here talking to you today about the book.
It's worth saying, by the way, that Penguin have a stall outside, actually next to the bookshop. It's worth chatting to Louisa and Ilse there who can tell you more about some of these
Yeah.
schemes. Is that scheme continuing now, or is that?
It is, and I mean, so Louisa is in the room, and she's wonderful, and I've worked with her from basically the very beginning. So I would highly encourage you to speak to her afterwards about the scheme, and it is still going.
Rachel, what about you?
When I was about 13 or 14, I decided I wanted to be a music journalist, and I started writing a local music fanzine, just interviewing bands and putting this fanzine together, stealing into the college library to photocopy it for free. And I suppose the people who read it encouraged me a little bit, and then I started writing my first novel, but I never thought it would be published or ever thought that I would show it to anyone, really, until I read Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and then I thought, yeah, I should give this a go.
And this book you said was a commission,
Yeah.
but your previous books, am I right in thinking, were not?
No.
Yeah. So how did this commission come about? You were just asked by the publisher to...
Well, I hadn't written books for a while. 10 years I'd been writing 3 political plays. And my publisher in Wales just thought, I think he just wanted somebody to write the Brexit story. Why did the people of the South Wales Valleys vote for Brexit? And he said, go on, it won't take you long. It's just a short novella and I'll pay you. So yeah, that's what it came about.
It was still 121 pages long, so it's... Okay. Alberto, what about you? When did you first think you wanted to be a writer?
Honestly, I began to be in love with books when I was a teenager, me too, as it usually happens. And but I didn't really had the idea to become a writer. I was already happy to be a reader. That was not something usual because in my family there were not many books at home. And also, I began to give up with football and to start to go to libraries, bookshop, and I can imagine that for a middle-class person, it's something quite ordinary to write a book to stay with foot inside culture. But that was already badly seen by my former friends. So I was not really happy to say, in my life, I want to be a writer, because mainly people prefer to be a football player. And honestly, it's only after going back from England that I realized that, of course, at school always they told me you should write the teacher because I was in some way good with that. But honestly, I have no idea from where to start because I had no relation in the cultural publishing system. And well, I want to tell you this funny story. Now that I am a writer, I went back to my town, that is the industrialized area in South Tuscany, and to give a talk about my books. And there was a very old guy that told me, you give up football to write, and you did well because you are better as a writer than as a footballer. In my book, I always say that I'm very good as a footballer. So he did some fact checking, but it is, I think, is in some way part of our identity, you know, the football, and it's still oddly seen. Once you go back, we say you are not a prophet in your own place, no? So go back with a book is still easier for me in Bristol than in my local village. So I still feel uncomfortable with the label of writer in some way.
Well, that's maybe something we could talk about as well. Brian, what about you? I mean, you've been a journalist for some years, and then book publishing, I guess, is another arm of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you say when did you? What the question was? When did you?
When did you want to become a writer?
Yeah, well, similar there to Alberto. We didn't have a lot of books in the house. I didn't read a lot of books when I was a kid, but I did read newspapers and specifically football reports. And I thought I'd love to do that. Wouldn't that be great doing it? And even get a job on the telly commentating. But I didn't think I would. I thought that's not for me. That's something, you've got to be very lucky, or you've even got to be able to do that. And I don't know if I could. Well, when I started to write creatively, because before I wrote books, I tried to have a go at writing a few plays, which weren't that successful. That means they were unsuccessful. But what inspired me to do that was I lived in a part of Liverpool called Huyton, an overspill area. And from there, Willie Russell and Alan Bleasdale came around this time. And these were just two ordinary fellas. One was that left school fit, he was a hairdresser, Willie Russell, and Alan Bleasdale was a school teacher. And the stuff they were doing was not just really locally kind of loved, but nationally and internationally. And I thought, well, if they can do that, you know, I mean, that's... So it goes back to what I said about, in the introduction, about, I think you need role models. You need to know, well, if someone from your background can do it and achieve something, well, why can't you? And so, as I say, I tried to write a few plays, and one half looked at and, you know, half put a rehearsed reading. But then I left that and carried on with my journalism. But in my head, I'd got the confidence to write creatively and put it in front of somebody. And that's what led to me not having any fear of writing a book. So I think it goes back to being inspired by people around you who've done it and then going, well, I can do that.
And Sharon?
I mean, similar to everyone, there's kind of crossovers with everyone here. I mean, I always wrote, but it was a bit of a dirty secret, really. It wasn't, and it was never anything I thought was a thing you could be. And it wasn't that my mum particularly wasn't interested in art and culture. You know, she watched a lot of brilliant films, Hindi films and things. And I come from a family where there were a lot of stories, you know, so there was a lot of people telling stories, but not reading books particularly. But I never thought a writer was something you could be until, and I can sort of name 3 exact moments really. One was when I was about 12 maybe, and my school, which was a really crap school, you know, in Lozells in Birmingham, nothing ever happened. We didn't get taught anything, but one of the teachers had the inspiration to take a few of us to see a poet called Linton Kwesi Johnson, and that absolutely changed the world for me. I was like, oh my God, you know, he's from a different background, but Handsworth, there's a lot of West Indian, a lot of Jamaican people, a lot of my friends, you know, we grew up around reggae music, and this was a sort of language I understood, and so that was the first thing. That was so powerful, and actually I took my sons to see him more recently in Brighton. And the second one was I read a book by an author called Buchi Emecheta when I was about 15. And again, it was a very different experience to my family or my life, but it was a book about her experience of coming to England and living in the sorts of houses my grandparents lived in, and how she was treated as a woman, a black woman, you know, and how she was ignored as well as kind of, you know, insulted and spat at and all these things that had resonance. And the third one was reading Hanif Qureshi and the Buddha of Suburbia. And again, it was a slightly different life to mine, but I thought, oh my God, you know, this is something. But I didn't actually think I could become a writer until I had my 3rd child, because my first 2 children are twins, so I didn't have any time. But my 3rd child was the first time when I was on maternity leave with my 3rd child, who's over there actually, she's just started at uni here. I actually had a bit of time because my twins had gone to school, and I thought, and I wasn't working full time for the first time ever. So I actually thought, oh, you know, the baby's asleep. I think I'll do a quick writing course online. So it did start then, really. But that was when I kind of did it a bit more seriously. Yeah.
Not only an inspirational story, but shows that you can find some time sometimes.
And also, you know, like Brian was saying, role models were, you know, so important and are still really important.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad both you and Brian have talked about this, because it was a question I wanted to ask you, so I'll come to the other 3. I mean, Mohsin, what about role models for you? Apart from the scheme and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm going to give you a depressing answer. The answer is there weren't any. Yeah. You know, it's funny now that I've written a book about life, people kind of ask you about like what you dreamt of as a child. And I remember the first time I got asked that question, I was stumped. And I realized the reason I was stumped was because we weren't told we could dream. It isn't something that is part of the fabric when you go to when you're raised in public housing and you go to a school that's not doing very well, there isn't this idea of you will get to be something. Brian mentioned that people came to his school. Unfortunately, we didn't have very much of that. So when I get asked about role models, it's really difficult to think of people other than people in my family, when I can talk about them, but there aren't people that were on the public stage that made me think, oh, I can do that. And I think that's why things like this festival are so important, because it's really important. I'm a governor at my old school, and I go back there, and to be honest, one of the main things that I'm doing is just standing in front of them so that they know that actually they don't have to stay in Walthamstow. If they want to, they can, but they don't have to stay in Walthamstow. So yeah, unfortunately, I think that the answer is most of the time, which is why Brian's book is so important, working class people aren't given role models.
Rachel, what about you?
I don't know, there was no books growing up in the house, but my mother cleaned the local library, and because she couldn't get childcare, she used to take me with her, so that's how I knew books existed. And I loved African-American female authors from America. That seemed to chime with me in a way that, well, there weren't any Welsh female. They're all men from Wales. Yeah, that's it really.
Yeah.
I had a couple of good English teachers who used to encourage me, but apart from that, no, I would never admit it to anybody that I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
That's just not something you would do.
Alberto, what about you? What about you? Role models growing up, who did you admire? Was there anybody in particular who encouraged you to write?
Yeah, mainly a few teachers. My mom was very supportive in this, more than my father. And my father was me to stay on the line of his own job, while my mother was in some way, even she would prefer to have me as not want to say a class traitor, but to go outside the class. While in one way, I'm closer to my father now than before. There were some teachers very, very supportive, especially I grew up in the 70s. There was a very particular moment in Italy in which working class people were proud of themselves. Now the 80s and the 90s were, when I was a teenager, I felt very sad because the mainstream idea was we are all middle class. If you carry on with this working class idea, you are just a loser. But when I was a bit younger, and I have some teacher politically trained also, they encouraged me a lot about being proud of my origins and to study and just to use, they say every book that you read is a kick less that you take from your boss. And that was very helpful to me, and that's why I read many books.
It's quite a good motto to believe, actually, thinking about that. I think we ought to introduce that one over here, actually. So if you have a bad boss, read a book, put it there.
Every book you write is a kick that you give it to your boss.
Oh, I see, right, there we are. So the lesson is read more books and write more books. So if you buy your books by all the authors, that's 5 kicks against your boss there. So, well, talking about working class stories and so on, because I remember when I look back at what I grew up in a council estate near Wolverhampton, and I don't remember reading much at school, actually, to be honest. But we were encouraged to. I just didn't particularly want to, and now I spend all my time doing it. But what really influenced me growing up was some things I saw on the television. And some people won't remember this now, but there was a series over a long period of time on BBC called Play for Today, which was about a lot of working class lives, actually, which you tend not to see nowadays on television. But what about telling working class stories? I mean, Brian, you've put a whole book here together. You've mentioned some of the names of the people you've written about. And I think if we just tell us a little bit about one of them, well, 2 of them really. The first is Jack Jones, the trade union leader, who's an incredibly inspirational story. But I knew him because he was always on the television when I was growing up, and there were lots of strikes and so on and that. And Barbara Castle is the other one, who has kind of been forgotten in recent years, but actually, looking back, is possibly one of the most influential politicians we have ever had in terms of success. There was I don't know whether people saw Boris Johnson recently at the Tory party, I don't suppose anybody saw Boris Johnson at the Tory party conference, but on the television he was doing these films where he was using this slogan, build back better, in a kind of jokey way. So he was eating fish and chips and he looked at the camera and said, build back batter. And then he was talking about rewilding and he said, build back beaver. You know, they weren't particularly funny and so on. But we did a session after this and someone pointed out, said what we should be saying, because it was Barbara Castle's anniversary, was build back Barbara, because she was the most influential politician. But tell us just briefly about those two characters, really.
Yeah, well, Barbara Castle, actually she's a divisive figure on the left,
Sure,
because she was forced to make a lot of, Harold Wilson made her make a lot of moves against the unions, pre-Thatcher, pre-winter discontent. And she saw it as a way of fending off Thatcherism, if you like. And a lot of people on the left went against it. But as Michael Foot said, she was the best socialist cabinet member I've ever seen. And if you're a woman, I mean, she's the kind of, you've got so much to thank her for, I mean, in terms of equal pay. Things like the family allowance getting paid to women, not men. And a raft of social policy changes, a raft of stuff like, she introduced the speed limit, the breathalyzer. I remember when I interviewed her once, she said to me, the Tory press hated me. She said, but the editors hated me more. And I don't know if it was because I made them get breathalyzed when they left the gentleman's club, or because I gave the women workers equal pay. And there's such a big truth in that. We called her the Red Queen, and she deserved that title. And she died actually a month or so later after the Queen Mother. Going back to the Prince Philip story, the Queen Mother, obviously, it was the whole world had to stop for a week in this country, everything, blah, blah, blah. And Barbara Castle, even in her old newspaper, The Mirror, because she worked there briefly in the 1940s, she got like half a page. You know, it was kind of, she was forgotten. But Jack Jones is someone, and I'm glad you said that you remember him from the telly. You probably remember Mike Yarwood doing impressions.
Oh, yeah,
of him,
absolutely,
you know,
yeah.
Because he was caricatured, he was lampooned by the right because he was so powerful, because he stood up, you know, he's the most powerful trade union leader at the time, and there was a Murray poll which said he was the most powerful man in Britain, but that was used as a weapon against him. But it was his story that was phenomenal. I'll tell it briefly because you want to move on, but he was born to abject poverty in the Garston Docks in Liverpool. I mean, to the point where, you know, he was asking the workers when they left for bread to eat, that level of poverty. Educated himself as a socialist, with the ragged trousers philanthropist, etc. In his 20s, he became the youngest ever councillor to sit in Liverpool City Council. And then he did something which always fills me with great admiration and pride about the working class people around the world, but in this country. I went to fight the Spanish Civil War. And we made a film about Jack, and me and some friends, and I went over to see the hill he got shot on, he got wounded. And I thought, imagine being someone in your 20s from a place like Liverpool. You're on this hill in the middle of summer in Andalusia, Andalusia, what's the northern Spain? Anyway, near Barcelona. Catalonia. And you're getting shot on from above by the Franco's troops. You're getting bombed by Hitler's and Mussolini's. You've got the shitty Russian rifles that are about 3 years old. You're ill-shod, and people next to you are dying, crying for their mother, you know, because they're just idealists who've gone out there and trained, and fought and almost died for your principles when you're 26. The government wouldn't back it, but you know, this government in France were non-interventionist because they actually slightly liked the idea of the left getting beaten. But come 4 years later, they fought because they said fascism is going to spread across Europe and we're going to stop it. Of course, 4 years later, 3 years later, they didn't have to go, and lots of working class men get slaughtered because they didn't do it. But then when Jack then comes back from Spain, he forms so many trade union reforms, basically makes the automotive industry unionized and brings in 5-day weeks. You know, people get Saturday afternoons off, they have holidays all of a sudden. And then he gets kind of despised because he's too powerful and the unions are getting too strong. And when he goes to retire at 65, he's offered all sorts of, you know, 3 times he's offered to become a lord, and he says, sod that, I'm not joining the House of Lords. And he gets £10,000 off his union. And he says, right, that's going into fund, I'm going to set up a pensioners convention. It's going to be a trade union for pensioners. I'm going to fight for pensioners' rights. And then he spends till he's 96 fighting. So that's a story which I think, you know, if you take away the fact that he was caricatured by the right and the establishment, and kids from working class areas were taught that story, it's got to inspire you, hasn't it?
And it's fair to say, I mean, in your book, you mentioned other people you cover, like Dennis Skinner, Muhammad Ali, Tony Benn, Bill Shankly and others, but you also cover, the less well-known people, the ones
I had to not do Tony because he's a bit too middle class.
Oh, right.
No, I do mention him in passing.
Yeah.
I'd go with Dennis Skinner, but yeah, I mean that's correct. Yeah.
Just bringing some of the others on there. I mean, when you write as a working class writer, do you feel that you have to solely restrict yourself to working class themes, people, issues, whether that's poverty, mobility, or whatever? Sharon, what about you?
I don't really see myself as a working class writer. I see myself as someone from a working class background who writes, and it would feel disingenuous to think of myself as working class now. I've got a mortgage, and the life I grew up in is not the life my kids are growing up in. But I think, not that I'm not proud of coming from the background I've come from, I think it's more for me about writing about the people I know, not actually know, but the sort of communities that I am intrinsically part of, immigrant communities, inner city communities, working class communities that I've grown up around. So it's more about, I think it was Toni Morrison, Rachel might know this better than me, who said, if you're not reading a story that, if the story isn't out there, you have to write it. So it was really that for me. So they're the people I want to write about, because I wouldn't know how to write, sorry, Mohsin, but I wouldn't know how to write about barristers. It's just not a world I know about, but I know about inner city communities, and I know about women, older women, immigrant women who become invisible. I know about men that have struggled and of all colours, of all backgrounds. So it's more about wanting to tell the stories of ordinary people for me, and for me, it's the ordinary people whose stories are most extraordinary, and particularly people like my grandparents and parents and people, like Alberto, people who have moved around for work and jobs and, experienced many different things, but also seen their lives change through all sorts of things that aren't necessarily to do with them, whether they're historical or political or material, so it's much more about that wider thing.
I think this is a really interesting subject, actually, because when Natasha was setting this up, I know that people said to her, what is a working class writer? Is it someone who is working class or was working class or claims to be or whatever? Alberto, do you claim yourself as a working class writer, don't you?
Yes, I do. Of course, I would like to write also about something else than working class, but keeping this idea of watching things through the filter of my belonging. For instance, I must admit that very often we are always writing about our own traumas, our own things, while middle-class writers that are not really defining themselves as middle class, they are brighter. As we are us that have to add something, no? That is part of the problem. They are maybe just developing a labyrinth of fancy stories, why we are always eating the shit that of our life. So this is part of the problem. I would, in some way, as I finish my trilogy, I'm a bit fed up. I don't want to carry on with that. It would be great to try to describe the middle class from our point of view, as sometimes some good French director belonging to the bourgeois have done, like Chabrol, for instance, describing the wars of the middle class from inside. No? Of course, I'm not inside, but I would like to do something like that. So this is part of our problem, that always we write about our life, and of course it's not easy to escape that, because if you work in a double shift, that's great, in a double shift, as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant, when you go back home, it's difficult to write, and to find the time, maybe also, as you said, if you're kids and so on. But when you start writing, you still have the noise of the dishing machine in your ears. So you are forced, obliged to write about your experience. That is something that middle-class people sometimes they don't do. They just forget their own experience. They work with their fantasy, with their... So this is a part of our problem, and it's something that we have to is a challenge for the new generation of working-class writers, I think.
What about you, Rachel? How would you class yourself?
I don't feel restricted to just writing about working class people. It just tends to be that way because I live in a working class area where I grew up. I went to university and now my life is slightly different, but I'm surrounded by people who are working class. I still call myself working class. My husband's a builder and we live in a working class area.
Where did you go to university?
The local university, which is called South Wales University now, and also Limerick in Ireland.
Okay. Mohsin, what about you? I mean, how would you describe yourself? And are you planning to write something next? Are you tempted with fiction or something like that? Or?
So I've been thinking about this, listening to the panelists' answers. I was reminded of this quote that James Baldwin gave when he was interviewed once. He said to be black and relatively conscious in America is to be angry all of the time. And I feel that way about class. I feel like underneath the surface, there are, and I am middle class now. I have a middle class job. I lead a middle class lifestyle. I have a mortgage. I kind of feel like an interloper. Like I was started off in one world and then I was put into another. But because I have this heritage, I'm angry. Because I see these people that I was at university with, supposedly the best university in the world, and frankly, a lot of them weren't cleverer than the people I was at school with. And yet now, they're the ones with the opportunities. They're the ones who are, going to be winning Oscars, starting businesses, presenting on the BBC. Whereas the people I was at school with are working at McDonald's or are working on building sites. And that anger of being able to see that there is this fundamental injustice in our society, and I'd say more than others, it sits here. And so when I'm writing, I write from here. So in some ways, it's really difficult for me to say, oh, I'm a working class writer or I'm a middle class writer. I can say I'm a writer who writes from here. And what exists here is an anger about a fundamental injustice. And I say this about Britain, and Brian and I were talking before this session started. I think it is worse here. We look at America and we say that, oh, well, that's a really capitalistic place, and aren't they just so focused on money? But even they don't have an education system that is as hierarchical as ours. What's more capitalistic, what's more opportunistic than paying for your children to go to the front of every queue at the start of life? And so for me, I think whatever I do write next, and I'll come on to that part of the question, it will be difficult for me not to write about the things that matter to me. In terms of what I'm writing next, I've got a couple of ideas. One's a non-fiction and one's a fiction. The fiction is set in Walthamstow, where I'm from, and it's about kind of a violent attack and the implications it has on the people around the victim. And then the non-fiction idea is around parenthood, because as a gay guy, it's much more difficult to think about what that means. And it's interesting because when I've started writing about it, and it is from such a place of privilege, because I'm talking about surrogacy, which costs so much money, or adoption, which also costs money, and there are certain requirements about having a house and a garden, and I'm mindful of that. So it was weird because with the first book, I was writing as an observer of the middle class world and about my entry into it. And now I'm writing about a very different personal experience with the privilege of a middle class person. And so it's writing almost from the opposite vantage point.
Let's talk about, I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment. Let's talk about publishing, and this is a question to all of you, and I'll come to you all in turn, about your experience of publishing and how routes to publishing could be made easier for you. I mean, Mohsin talked about the scheme he was on, and perhaps he could reflect either a little bit more on that or other aspects. But Sharon, what about you? You've been published by Blue Moose, which is a kind of growing independent based in the north of England.
In Hebden Bridge. I think it's a can of worms, publishing, really, because there are a lot of schemes, and they're really great schemes, and actually I wouldn't have been published unless I had a little bit of work showcased in a report which was about the lack of diversity in publishing, and I'd kind of almost given up thinking I'd ever be published before that. So Blue Moose contacted me through that, but I had been rejected through tons of agents, tons of publishers who basically said, well, who's going to want to read about a British Asian family in Handsworth in Birmingham? They're just, there isn't the audience, which is obviously bullshit, because lots of people did read it. And I was very proud when it was the Morning Star's Fiction Book of the Year. But I think the problem with those schemes, not so much the report I was in, because that was from a literature development project who were trying to sort of disrupt the landscape in some way. But the problem with the schemes is that they are, I don't want to kind of badmouth schemes because I think it's really great they're doing it, but actually the structures don't change. So the people at the top of those publishing companies, the agents, the editors, the people who are picking up the books and going, well, that's about a British Asian family, that's going on the slush pile because I don't relate to that story. Until those things change in publishing, nothing really will change, I think. And I don't know how those things will change because, because the whole country needs, capitalism needs, education particularly needs to change, and the opportunities for people to, get into these industries. But yeah, I think, I think there are different ways of publishing, which I think is exciting, and obviously people can self-publish. There's different models, there's online publishing, there's fanzines, and kind of that kind of thing as well still around. So, but I think the big five who do control everything in publishing in terms of marketing and who wins prizes, because, prizes, you have to pay to submit for prizes, and you have to, little publishers like mine, they have to pledge £10,000 for marketing. £10,000 is probably my publisher's annual budget for publishing books. So, yeah, so I think there's a lot that has to change, really, and it has to be on all levels.
And I think that was one of the shocking things when independents began to get more on the list of things like the Booker Prize. Suddenly, this talk about how it was simply such a large budget you had to contribute to this. I think they might have dropped that for the Booker Prize. Did I read that somewhere? I don't think so. No, they haven't? Oh, right, okay. Rachel, what about you? What lessons for publishing?
It's very, very similar, really. I'm really lucky to have this Welsh independent behind me, and they always have been. And when I won the Dylan Thoms Prize with my short stories, the big five lined up, and I went with HarperCollins, and they just didn't know how to market me. So they knew that people were interested because I'd won a prize, but they just didn't know how to sell me. Like, was I chick lit or was I a female Irving Welsh? Those were the two models they had, and that's the only way they understood me. And I'm neither of those things, so yeah.
Okay, Alberto, you not only have to get published here, but you also have to get translated. That's an added complication, I guess, is it?
Oh, especially in English is a very difficult one, because this has to do with the English publishing industry that is not only middle-class centered, but is also English centered. And it seems that you translate only 100% of the book published both in Great Britain and the United States, while in other countries, for instance, in Italy, in the past we were translated 35% of our books. Now it's less, something like 25%. Same in French, Spain, or Greece. So already being translated, it's important, and of course is something that is important. We in the Italian publishing industry we have many structural problems. Of course, one has to do with the prices. The prices are a factor that really move lots of sellings of copies, and very often prices are just in the hand of the recipient are always the same 4 or 5 big publishers, and the money of the prize are given by the usually banks or industrial association. So even if there is a price that has to do with the work and in industry, but the sponsor is the main industrial association in Italy. So it's really difficult that the working class voices are represented. It's more easy to get the story of a boss that's telling how good is with the hard working you can change things and so on. So these are just problems, but we are fighting against the odds, but it's also possible in some way also.
Yeah. Mohsin, I mean, how did your publisher sell your book? You have a good backstory, as they say. So.
Well, my publisher's in the room, so I need to
All right.
be careful. So I actually did have a great experience. They were really supportive. I'm going to come back to your other question, though,
Sure.
which was about what we should be doing. And I know, fundamentally, I think we should stop giving platforms to privately educated people. Not entirely, but like look at 7% of kids in this country go to private schools, and yet they disproportionately are overrepresented in the judiciary, in medicine, Oscars, Brit Awards, publishing. I'm tired of it. And it's not going to change unless publishers are looking at the agents they're working with, looking at the authors they're publishing, and trying to figure out how bad that kind of skewed number is. And I'm going to give you a concrete example. Race. I'm so sick of talking about identity as if they all exist in silos. Talking about race without class is like critiquing a Nando's menu without talking about the chicken. Yes, you can make some valid observations, but the meat is missing. And yet, if you look on The Guardian, or you look on The Telegraph, or you look at all the books that we talk about on race, a lot of them are by privately educated ethnic minorities. And frankly, I don't want to hear from a privately educated ethnic minority about how hard it was to go through a microaggression. Like, that's just, I mean, yeah, okay, fine. I would love to live in a world where people get my name right all of the time. But when you are disproportionately more likely to die if you are a black woman giving birth, it's also because you're a poor black woman giving birth. When you are disproportionately more likely to be incarcerated, 50% of all of the children, that's people under the age of 18, that are in prison at the moment are ethnic minorities. When you're disproportionately more likely to have health conditions, you've got shorter life expectancy, and your economic opportunities are limited. When those things are still a problem, then I want to hear from those voices. So for me, the source of frustration lies in too much platforming to people that we've heard so much from already. Sorry, I get quite emotional about it because it's so frustrating because you can see it happening all the time, and even The Guardian, who I've got a lot of respect for, do it all the time. I almost want it to say, this writer is privately educated. I want people to be named and shamed. Not that it's a bad thing to go to a private school, but I just want to live in a world where we're honest about how much privilege being from that background gives you. And I also don't care if it's because you got there from a scholarship. It still gives you privilege. I have privilege being a man and going to Oxford, and I acknowledge that. But I do think that if we're going to see any meaningful change, then something like quotas or something just short of quotas on state school kids is a direction to move into.
And Brian, just finally, your book is published by Mirror Books, which is obviously owned by the newspaper and so on. Well, what's your view of the publishing process? And
Well, that's interesting, that, because the first book I wrote was about football, so everyone's keen on football, aren't they? And it was about Liverpool, so big following. Oh, we'll sell that. So an agent in London took that. Pam Macmillan published it. It did well. A couple of years, so then they wanted the book. So a couple of years later, I said, I don't want to write about football again. You know. So anyway, the second book was about football, but it was about a takeover by a hedge fund, American hedge fund for Liverpool. So it was a big battle. It was more a journalist book about the battle to kind of get rid of them. So there was a lot of social justice and politics involved in it. And that did even better. So they wanted another book about football. I said, I don't write about it. So a few years down the line, I didn't write anything as a book. And I came up with this idea. And the agent said, yeah, that should be okay. And the same literary editor I'd had for those, one was Quercus, one was Parliament Mill, and said, yeah, okay, great, yeah, he loved it. And tried to sell it to them, and they all, oh, yeah. And he said, look at the figures for the previous 2 books. This fella's great. Yeah, but he's not writing about football. I said, well, there's some football in it. He writes about Bill Shankly, you know. And they went, yeah, but it's working. And whoever made the decision went, yeah, how are we going to sell? It's not sexy enough, is it? You know. And it goes back to what we've been talking about is that some on the panel, very London-centric, extremely London-centric, are probably the most middle-class profession in the country is publishing, and probably more nepotism there than anything. And well, what's that relate to? So he took it to its Reade Publishing, which is based in Liverpool. It's part of the Mirror Group, but it's a different group. And the people in Reade, who were mainly ex-journalists from Liverpool newspapers, not necessarily university educated or whatever, thought, oh, that's really good, we love that. And they did the offer. So it was outside of London. It wasn't the kind of bubble of... and I think that's a big problem. And another problem what you just said in the brilliant is how do writers get it? Is mentoring is so important. I'm involved in a scheme at the moment with New Writing North, the Mirror and the New Statesman, where we help writers to try and get published. The New Statesman are going to publish some of these people's short stories or columns. And I got linked up to this 49-year-old fella from Barrow, and a gay fella who wants to write about gay issues, and he really has, and I wasn't sure. He felt like a lot of working class people do, that imposter syndrome. This is not for me. I'm a hairdresser in Barrow, but I've always wanted to write, and I can really write, and how am I going to get in? There's no pathway, there's no contacts. I'm in Barrow, I'm not in London. I didn't go to university. How do I do it? And I just had a few sessions about how to write a column, because you had to write a 550-word column for the New Statesman. And he picked up a few things, yeah. And then he took 2 weeks, he couldn't do it. He said, I panicked. I couldn't send it to you because you're a columnist on a national newspaper. I felt you're going to laugh at it. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And I went, well, just send it anyway. And, you know, if I laugh at it, I'll laugh at it. And it was brilliant. It was genuinely brilliant. I was bowled over. You know, I've written a lot of columns in my time over many years, and I just thought, there's not a lot I need to tell him, just a bit more confidence, a few technical things about how to do it. And genuinely, you hit on the percentage of public school kids. 44% is called the Sutton Trust. 44% of columnists on national newspapers were public school educated. Now, how on God's earth is that a world view and it's 7% of the kind of... And we're talking about, it might surprise people, I'm sure there's a lot of Guardian readers here. The Guardian is full of people who went to public school. And it's the same voice that's coming through. They might throw the odd token on, they might be odd working class, the odd Asian writer they throw in, and that's not to decry their writing, but that's the viewpoint. And this I said, you know what, you're going to think I'm bullshit, you know, but that is better than a lot of columns I have read. He wrote specifically about homophobic attacks, and he encapsulated it brilliantly in 550 words. He said, that should be in a national newspaper now, because it's really important. And he wrote it with humour, the key element to writing the column. And it was just brilliant. And again, he was so chuffed, and it's going to be in the New Statesman. I didn't do anything. I just kind of gave him a bit of confidence. But that's something that's needed, mentoring. But kids need to know that they can do it. When I say kids, unpublished writers. Yeah.
Let's see if there's any questions from the audience or any comments. I think, is there a roving mic? Yeah, brilliant. So if you signal to me you want to ask a question or make a comment, we'll get the mic to you. Yes, over on here, yeah. I'll see if I need to...
Thank you. One of the questions I had was about barriers, and I've heard a lot about exposure. Most of you didn't grow up with books, and you know, people look up to who are writers. I was thinking about audiobooks. Because as a working class person, a lot of times your hands are full. There's no free time, but they have to commute back and forth to work or to washing dishes or something like that. And I think it would be useful, asking your opinion, to have audiobooks in the voices of the authors themselves, so that these working class people can have someone to look up to and say, you know, that's my voice, that's from my town, that's from my area. And also so that they can make the time to hear about it, to expand the audience, and then maybe become writers themselves.
So this was a question about audiobooks.
Yeah, audiobooks is a way to sort of reach more working-class audience to bring them into, give them mentors as well, so they have an idea of that this can be done from someone from my local area is reading the book. I can understand with it.
So first of all, are your books, any of your books, audiobooks?
My books aren't audiobooks yet, but this is another thing like, this is about publishing as well, because audio rights get sold like foreign rights get sold, and film rights get sold. And if you're with a small independent publisher who are often the people that will take more risks with writers from different kinds of backgrounds, they don't usually have that machinery in place. So there's a bit of a thing there. But interestingly, this Should We Fall Behind, which is my second novel, is hopefully, it's not all signed and sealed yet, but is getting made into an audiobook by a new production company who are trying to do things slightly differently. And I said to my publisher, oh, that's brilliant, but I really want to talk to them about narrators, because it can't be Stephen Fry or, you know, or you know, and some of them are brilliant. Yeah. I was just thinking there's a woman who does a lot of them. Anyway, I can't remember her name. But so they were really, really amenable, and they said, and I said, you know, I didn't want it to be me, because I think it's a different skill, reading a book and writing a book. And so they went on the search for narrators, and they sent me some auditions to listen to last week. And hopefully we found one. And just really bizarrely, it's a young guy that went to, you know, they don't know anything about me or my background. They just know the little extract from the book. But he went to a school round the corner from where I grew up in Handsworth. And he's a young actor. And he was the one that I said, well, I really like him, because he doesn't necessarily sound like the characters, but he sounds more like me, you know. But it was quite hard for them to find 5. And of the 5 they sent me, 3 of them, there was just no way, you know. There was just absolutely no way. So there was only a choice of 2, really. And luckily, one of them was great, but it was difficult. So, yeah, it's another thing, isn't it?
Mohsin, is yours an audiobook? And
Yeah.
Did you read it?
I did, yeah.
You did?
Yeah, I did. And that was...
Which I think is a bit different with a memoir, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is different. Also, I don't know about you guys, but I hate the sound of my recorded voice, and you're subjected to 3 days of it because you're listening as you're speaking. So it was awful. But to your point, I think it's a really good one, and actually, I think it's a good one in more than one way, because much like my fellow panelists or some of them, I didn't grow up in a house full of books or with parents who were readers, and when I was told that, okay, you're on the Write Now program, we'd like you to write a book, my first thought was, oh my God, now I have to actually write a book. And somebody said to me, to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. And up until the age of 32, whatever it is when I started writing, I wasn't a particularly good reader. And audiobooks was my way in, because they felt less intimidating. Like, if I saw a massive book, I would never have picked it up. But audiobooks really helped me, and I saw that experience reflected back in my family and in my friends when this book was published, because some of them found it way easier to know that they could listen, and it just made reading more accessible. So I think you're completely right. I think making audiobooks more readily available to, particularly in schools, would be a fantastic thing.
Yeah, definitely.
You said the position is different in Italy, did you say?
Yeah, because we don't have in Italy audiobook is not really developed as a thing, so it's not really something that you find easily. But the problem of a middle class voice overlapping with a working class voice, we have it in the translation process. For instance, just that if you take, as the accent here in Great Britain has a lot to do with class. If you translate slang language in a standardized middle-class Italian voice, you have killed something really important. For instance, Shaggy Bane by Douglas Stewart is grammatically very well translated, but all the slang in the dialogues in Italian are lost. So this is a kind of problem. It's not really the problem that you have signed, but it has to do with that in some way.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yes, please, yeah. I should say I really try and get a gender balance with comments and questions, but you go next. Could you put your hand up, yeah?
Hi. Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in, talking about how you're sort of literally getting allowed into that world of publishing that isn't controlled by working class people, and it's almost like is it sort of like a co-option? It's like we're allowed a little bit in, but the narrative's still controlled by capital and profit and how that's going to play out. Otherwise, you don't, if it doesn't make money, potentially you won't get published or whatever. So there's a whole other dynamic going on, which isn't related to art or what's being said. And I'm wondering, at a time where the narrative is so important in this country and how people are being portrayed through the media and that, is how do you see story and working class stories as actually being a vehicle for actual social change, of maybe eradicating class? It's not about like, let's keep working class. Surely we want to move to a place where class isn't an issue.
I mean, Sharon, you talked, and Mohsin, you talked a little bit about the education system and so on. Rachel, what about you? Do you think things are changing? Do you think that we can move towards that?
No, I don't think things are changing. I think they're getting worse.
Getting worse, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they are changing. They're getting worse.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, because a lot of people ask me, do you think you're changing something when somebody hears your story? And the answer is no, because you're sort of preaching to the converted, really. You are talking to Guardian readers.
Okay, Brian, you write for a newspaper which does try and
Yeah, I mean,
change happen.
I don't know if I could quickly link back to the question before. Do you feel yourself that you still working class? And I've got a working class mindset, but I've been a well-paid journalist for many years, and I went to university, so I fraudulently wouldn't call myself working class. But I know what you're talking about, a place inside. And looking back, my newspaper work and my books are written for working class people. It just happens to be that when you see an audience in your head, that's who. Like my newspaper, the Daily Mirror, mainly older, mainly northern, but working class people, left of centre politics. And it is a sense of preaching to the converted in a way, As to how you break that down, I just think you need to, those figures you threw out before, I threw out before, 44% of newspaper columnists went to public school, 54% of top journalists went to public schools, and it's right across the professions. And I think unless you get back to a fundamental change, well then the working class and working class voices are by definition always going to be marginalised.
Okay, is there any more questions or comment?
Can I just come in?
Please, Sharon, yeah.
Just about what the questioner said about that, about the narrative still being controlled in some way. And, I think there's a friend of mine who's on his 5th novel. He's a black guy from Hackney, and he's just a brilliant writer. He's won a BAFTA for a thing he wrote about the Windrush experience of his brother last year. But he's written his latest novel. He just can't get it published.
Right.
And he was told that the reason they're not interested in it is because it hasn't got enough black issues in it. There's not enough race issues in it. And so, so yes, it is still being controlled. I'm sure Ian McEwan doesn't get asked these questions about class and, are you ever going to, write anything that isn't about middle-class people in North London or whatever. So, yeah, it's still very much controlled. And even going back to the audiobook thing, because one of the things I'd said to this company was, what I really don't want is someone coming and doing a sort of Peter Sellers birdie num-num voice for when they're doing my Indian characters. And, of course, that's what I got sent, Yeah, so, this... And that's to do with all sorts of things, but yes, it's being controlled. It has to change.
I've got one more question. I just wanted to ask, first of all, if a woman wanted to ask a question, just to be fair to the gender balance. No? Okay. Well, this has to be the final question. Yeah, the mic's coming to you, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say I'm Cole and I'm chairing the next session at 2:45 where we're going to be exploring some of those issues, exactly that issue. Can you actually make a difference through what you write? So I thought it would be wrong of me not to plug that now. So I have. But the other point I wanted to pick up from what Brian said was that in my experience of 20 plus years of working for national newspapers, the more you go into the left or the centre left of those broadsheets or those papers, the more class-ridden they get. And the more you go to the right, the more you get the opportunity for anyone to write if you've got the right story. And that is a really serious problem that needs to be addressed.
Sure.
Well, Cole saved me a job there because I was just about to advertise his session there.
Thank you.
So, just to let you know. So we have come to an end, I'm afraid. It's been a real honour to chair this. There's so many issues that have come up, and I hope you do join the next session, which will take forward some of these issues that have been addressed. If you'd like to get copies of the author's books, they're available from Storysmith Books outside. And as I mentioned before, there is also the Penguin. There's Louisa and Ilsa from Penguin, who will happily talk through some of the issues that have been raised and about their role in the company and some of the things that they're doing as well. Thank you for coming this morning. And thank you most of all to our panel. Thank you, Brian, Mohsin, Sharon, Rachel, and Alberto. Thank you very much. Sorry, on the Penguin store, you can get a badge which says, "I'm wondering what to read next." And I think there are 5 books here that you should be reading next. Maybe all 5 or one of them or whatever, but do take advantage of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's great.